The Yamaha Ym2612. This chip is responsible for handling the audio for the Sega Mega Drive, a console released in 1989 by Sega. So, what gives exactly? Why am I talking about such a specific piece of obsolete hardware? Well, when you think of retro game sounds, you probably think of stuff like this. For comparison, here's the Yamaha. Like, holy shit, right? Technology had finally reached the point where game composers could realise technically ambitious, musically complex soundtracks, though this wasn't easily done. FM synthesizers, like the 2612, were notoriously difficult to work with. Combined with spotty documentation, composers had a hard time getting the most out of the hardware.
Decide to step up to this kind of power, this kind of challenge, this kind of flying, crashing feeling. When you decide to get serious, there's only one place to come, the games of Super Nintendo.
Released 2 years after the Mega Drive, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES, was equipped with a different audio setup. Let's break this down a bit. The SNES primarily uses samples for its music, samples being short recordings of sounds like instruments or vocals. Due to the memory constraints of the system, 64 kilobytes of RAM available to the audio chip for those keeping score, these samples couldn't be very big. There were some creative uses of sampling during the SNES's life, but generally speaking, the samples sounded quite muffled and limited. This muffling is compounded by the use of a Gaussian filter over top of the audio. Similar to the Gaussian blur tool in Photoshop, this filter is used to mask noise in the samples used, removing harsher elements while also discarding some detail. By contrast, the Mega Drive sound chip is a dedicated synthesizer. Rather than playback samples, it's set up as an instrument, generating different waves on each channel. By cleverly combining each channel, you get a layered, interesting sound with a very distinct signature. It's interesting then to compare the output of these two systems. With such wildly different approaches to audio output, you get some quite noticeable discrepancies between games. Take Capcom's Street Fighter II for example. Arguably, the Super Nintendo's output sounds nicer here. The use of real instruments, as muffled as they are, lends the track a certain impact that the Mega Drive version lacks. The real power of the Mega Drive, in my opinion, isn't really reflected by direct comparison. Instead, we need to take a look at some exclusive titles, and when it comes to Sega exclusive games, where better to start than with Sonic the Hedgehog. Putting aside for a second just how good that bass line is, the use of glissando on the melody is something that couldn't be achieved using a sample-based system like the Super Nintendo, or at least not without some major trickery. The fact that each sound is generated by the 2612 itself rather than being pre-recorded allowed composers a greater degree of freedom with manipulating each channel. Of course, this is all ultimately subjective, and kinda unimportant. As soon as the next generation of consoles were released, games switched to using CD audio, making the difference in audio chips all but irrelevant. Still, the difference in approach between systems remains an interesting footnote in the history of gaming as a whole, with these limitations breeding creativity and bringing out the very best in some composers.